I want to introduce it, just talking a little bit about my story. 1997 was a huge year, and some of you weren't even born, so I get it. This is going to be like way over your head. But there's a few middle-aged folk in the room, and we're okay. We were around in 1997. We're kind of proud of it. But there was a lot happened in the world that year. Princess Diana died in Paris. Remember that? 1.5 billion people watched her funeral. Tiger Woods won his first Masters at the age of 21, making him the youngest person ever to do so. More importantly, of course, the Spice Girls were formed, and they released Wannabe. Tell you what I want, what I really, really want. The Philosopher's Stone had just been released, the first Harry Potter book. Titanic had just come out, 14 nominations at the Academy Awards. And here in Australia, the Adelaide Crows won the AFL. And they beat my team, the St Kilda Saints. That's not my team. Well, it's kind of my team. It's kind of my team. I'll explain that another time. But 1997 was a huge year for me because that was the year that I became a follower of Jesus. I was almost 18 years old when I heard and received the good news that Jesus loved me. Jesus had died for me. He rose again. He sent his Spirit. And that Spirit was inviting me into a relationship with God the Father through the work of the Son. I hadn't grown up going to church, guys. I wasn't even nominal. Like, I wasn't playing the game at all. I was just getting on with my life, having a great time, playing rugby, partying hard, occasionally studying, should have studied more, having fun, just getting on with things. When from out of nowhere, I encountered Jesus and his message and his messengers, a group of young, passionate Christians who befriended me and prayed for me, invited me to stuff just like this, and included me, and who ultimately led me into a relationship with Jesus. And for the last 25 years, which I get for some of you is like longer than you've been on the planet, but for the last 25 years, I've been learning what it means to follow Jesus. But probably, and more important than that, is I've been learning who Jesus is. Who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus that radically invaded my life 25 years ago and took a hold of me and has been changing me and transforming me and leading me and loving me faithfully all this time? You know, whenever I became a Christian, everyone was surprised. Like, nobody could believe that I had become a Christian, especially not me. I was most surprised of all. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't believe in a million years that God could love someone like me. I was selfish. I didn't pray. I didn't read the Bible. Wasn't holy in any way. I was reckless. I wasn't a good person. And yet what I discovered is that God's love is always surprising. And today I want to talk to you about the surprising love of God. And we're going to focus in on the surprising love of God that's found in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to read together a few verses in chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel. If you want to turn it up, don't worry. The scriptures will come on the screen as well. Verses 9 to 13. It's the story of Matthew, the man who would actually pen this gospel announcement, the gospel according to Matthew. This is his personal testimony. Verse 9, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. What a surprising moment this must have been for the young tax collector sitting at his booth, that he would be invited to follow a rabbi like Jesus. But even more so, surprising for those of us who are looking in, that Jesus would invite a tax collector to join his disciples. Verse 10 says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, as is their behavior, because they're not comfortable with the idea of dining with these sinful people, the Pharisees asked the disciples, why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners? Now, they asked the disciples, but Jesus heard the question. They must have been talking pretty loud. Religious people have a way of doing that, by the way. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And then I would suggest to us this morning comes the most surprising verse to be found anywhere in the Bible. Jesus says this, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now that's from the NIV, is the Northern Ireland version. If you have a New Living Translation, and that's the version of the Bible, I love how the authors of the New Living Translation put it, where Jesus says, I have come not to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. I just love the way that language is put. Thinking you're righteous or knowing you're a sinner. Now, I know which camp I fall into, and I know some of you know that as well. And that's why this is such good news. Because Jesus didn't come to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. And so Matthew's story, we call it the gospel according to Matthew, is a story of good news. Well, good news if you know you're a sinner. Not so good news if you think you're righteous. This is the surprising love of God, guys. The invitation to an imperfect, unholy people to enter into a relationship with a perfect and holy God through Jesus. That is good news. This month at Riverview, we are journeying together through a series of talks that we have called Portraits. Basically, we're giving these little snapshot overviews of each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's not so much a series of well-crafted sermons as it is a call to the church and an invitation to participate with us in good news as we seek to follow Jesus and discover more about who Jesus is. And if we're going to do that, we need to know the Gospels. We need to read the Gospels, and the Gospels need to become a part of our lives. That's where we learn about who Jesus is so that we can follow him. And I got to tell you, I'm super excited about this month because we're going to talk about Jesus a lot. And we've just spent the last month talking about us as a church. And to be honest, after a month of talking about ourselves, it just starts to feel a little bit icky. Like it's one selfie too many, right? And so to turn our perspective away from ourselves for a little bit and towards Jesus feels like the right time and the right word for us in this next season. So the Gospels are very complex. If you've been reading through them, through your reading plan this year, you might be wrestling with that as well. What is it with the Gospels? How they share some stories, and yet at the same time, some of them have unique parts of the story. What is going on? Well, basically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are using a genre that was very familiar in the ancient world called bios, where we get the idea of biography or autobiography. They are very intentionally shaping the material. So they're taking the stories of Jesus, the teaching that they would have learned from him or had been passed to them, and they're shaping that in such a way so that the readers, so that's us, so that we capture a certain portrait of Jesus. There's a picture of Jesus that they want us to see to help us understand. Like, I love biographies. That is without doubt my favorite type of book. And just over the past few weeks, I just finished an absolutely fantastic autobiography about Ernest Shackleton, the Irish explorer. Of course, who's a very famous explorer, especially for his antics in the Antarctic. An amazing, amazing man. Now, Ranulph Fiennes, who wrote this particular book, is a world-famous explorer in and of himself. And what I find so interesting about this book, and I've read a whole bunch of books about Shackleton in the past, is this book, instead of being focused on the great and mighty deeds that this man accomplished, it was actually really focused on the man himself, his character, who he was. And I got to tell you something, after coming to the end of that book, as wonderful as it was, I just thought to myself, Steve, I need a new role model. I need a new hero, because it turns out Ernest Shackleton was an incredibly flawed man. He was a terrible dad, a terrible husband, a real womanizer, terrible with money. Actually, so many things. Well, he was Irish, so that just about explains it all. But the point is this. The point is that it takes multiple stories to put together the big picture. And that's what's happening in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Multiple stories to give to the church a more full, a more truthful, more accurate picture of who Jesus is. Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get clarity as the early church on who is the authentic Jesus. Who is this authentic Jesus? On Tuesday nights in the McCready house, doesn't matter if Rebecca has to prepare lessons for kindergarten on Wednesday, if the kids have homework, if Steve needs to prepare for a meeting or write a message. At like 5 p.m. on a Tuesday night, all the computers are closed, all the books are closed, and we begin our weekly ritual of family night. And Shay and I march around the house chanting, family night, family night. And what ensues is an event that has been organized by one of the members of our family. So Rebecca might organize it one week, and she always wants to go to the beach and take photographs of beautiful sunsets. Shay might want to go to the mall or the shopping center. I'll just translate for myself there, out of Canadian and into Australian. Or Isabella might want to go to the park. So we all take turns. Now, I've heard a rumor that coming up this week, that Rebecca, Izzy, and Shay have actually ganged together to prepare for family night, a special challenge for Steve. It's the Pepsi challenge. It's doing the rounds on TikTok at the minute, but basically I'm going to be blindfolded, and as a lover of Pepsi, I'm going to need to distinguish, can I actually tell authentic Pepsi? Now, back in the day, that used to be easy. There was just Pepsi or Coke, and everything was made from real sugar. So it was like easy, easy, easy. But the modern version of this game is very complex. It's set against the backdrop of Diet Pepsi, Pepsi Max, Coke, Diet Coke, Coke Zero. Then, you just throw out of the blue like a no-name brand cola into the mix. That can really throw you. But I got to tell you, I am quietly confident that I'm gonna pass the challenge. But it's all about finding the authentic Pepsi. The gospel writers are living in a world where the stories about Jesus have been translated not by written word, but by spoken word. It was oral tradition. And you guys know what happens when people talk. Stories shift, stories change, stories can be influenced by lots of things, experience, mood, all of that stuff. You have embellishment, you have suspicion, you have the human side of communications. And within a generation of Jesus' time on earth, the church were watching the dust settle on what we call today Christology, which is the theology of Jesus. Who was Jesus? Who was the Christ? And the church is searching to know who is the authentic Jesus, because do you know what they didn't want? The Pepsi Max version or the Diet Coke version. They wanted the real and full Jesus. And Matthew, who is an incredibly bright man, a great scholar who had been working as a tax collector until Jesus touched and transformed his life, steps into this moment and steps into this challenge and decides, led by the Spirit, that he is going to paint for the church a portrait of Jesus. And that's what his gospel is, a picture of Jesus for his world to understand. Now, for you and I to understand the Jesus that Matthew is trying to paint for us, we need to understand his world a little bit, because this book was written to a specific people at a specific time in a specific place. In 1997, the world was rocked by the death of Diana. This year, our world has been rocked by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine or COVID. See, all of us have or will live through world-changing moments of history. And Matthew's world had just lived through theirs. Now, if you're a Bible scholar, if you know the New Testament times or a little bit of history, you might be familiar with this. But in the year 70 AD, after a series of uprisings, the Roman army marched into Jerusalem with all their might, all their experience, and all their technology, and they reduced the city to ashes. The population was decimated, and refugees were forced to towns and cities across the region, and the Jewish population was reduced to its knees. This was the darkest moment in their history, and it's into this moment that Matthew's writing. And so as you read the Gospel of Matthew, that we'd love you to do over the week ahead, we'd love you to dive in there. At times it feels dark. And that's because the world was dark. Matthew's world was a dark world. Interestingly, before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, Judaism had been flourishing. If you can remember back to the book of Acts, Pentecost, the Apostle Peter stands up to preach the gospel, preaches the gospel, and there are lots of people saved. But there that day, hearing the gospel, were groups of Jews and God-fearers that had come from all over the world. Judaism was alive and was vibrant and was influenced by the nations. There were lots of different sects to Judaism. But after the fall of Jerusalem, it kind of disappeared and decimated. And so at the time of Matthew's writing, there were really only two groups left within the world of Judaism. The first, you'll be familiar with these guys, were the rabbinical Jews, really those that we think of when we think of the Pharisees. And the second was actually a new sect of people who were emerging out of the Jewish faith, and they were known as the Way, or you might have heard of them called the early church, because that's who they were. They were a group of Jews who were emerging out of Judaism. And so Matthew isn't writing to a diverse world. That's something for us to keep in mind. He's writing to a divided world. Because basically at the time of Matthew's gospel, his world had fallen into two camps: rabbinical Jewish people and the church, this new emerging people. And Matthew's writing very specifically at this moment because something's happening in the mix there. And that is that there are people trying to live between these two worlds. There are people essentially trying to live with one foot in the synagogue and one foot in the church. And Matthew's gospel is a challenge to this way of doing life, where he essentially says, this isn't how the gospel works. The surprising love of God demands allegiance. And so you have to make your mind up. Is it going to be the old way or the new way? Is it going to be the old covenant or the new covenant? You can't dabble in both. Let me just share you a little story from my past week. We went out as a family with some friends. I thought we were going right out to the outback, but it turns out the hills are more like the suburbs. And so we're out in the hills, and we found this little kind of water space called the Susanna Brook. There's not a lot of water left in it, but there was enough to have some fun. So we were in swimming around, and we had some kayaks, and we blew up our paddle boards, and we had a couple of paddle boards, and we were having a great time. There was a rope swing. Nothing could go wrong until Shay, my son, my 10-year-old son, decided, he thought this would be a really good time to try to see if he could paddle two stand-up paddle boards at the same time. And so off he goes with one foot on one and one foot on the other, and out he goes into the brook, and you can just see as all of a sudden the boards, you know where this is going to go, right? The boards just start to pull apart. And they pull apart and they pull apart. And I watch my 10-year-old son for the very first time, he's not a gymnast, for the very first time do a full front splits. And he's holding it, and he's holding it, and he's trying for as long as possible, but eventually what happens? Boom, he falls, because he can't live divided. And this is a huge word for Matthew, this word divided, distazo, to stand in two places. He uses it multiple times in his gospel. You can't stand in two places. Here's Shay on the board. Poor kid walked like John Wayne for a week after that experience. Matthew's gospel is targeted to a group of people who are dabbling with Jesus, but they don't want to give up their old lives. They don't want to give up their old traditions. They don't want to give up their old comforts, their old identity. The same time, he's writing to a group of people who understood rabbinical Judaism, a world that Matthew was very familiar with. In fact, in one of the other Gospels, he's called Levi, which would give us a little bit of a clue as to who Matthew was before he became a tax collector, is that he probably came from the Levite tradition, and so he would have grown up around the law, very familiar with worship and all the things that come with temple life. And it's really, Matthew's such a smart man, and you can see that in how he writes his gospel. Did you know this? And you might be familiar with this. Did you know that Matthew actually divides his gospel into 5 teaching blocks of Jesus? The 5 teaching blocks of Jesus. And the reason he does that is very intentional. It's to mirror the 5 teaching blocks of the Old Testament that you would know as the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Matthew actually sets his gospel up as, here are the 5 books of Moses, but let me show you the 5 books of Jesus. Okay, because he's building a case. That's what his gospel is. It's a case, a portrait, a picture that he's trying to help his readers understand who Jesus is. See, Matthew's goal is to convince his readers of something that it's very, very hard for you and I to wrap our head around, but to his hearers at the time would have been so surprising and so radical, like God's love itself. Let me sum it up for us here with these 4 statements. 4 things that are very easy for me to say, 4 things that are very easy for you as a Christian living in this side of history to receive. But try to just imagine hearing this as a Jewish person who's grown up immersed in the old covenant Matthew's gospel through Jesus, about Jesus, says these four things. Number one, Jesus is greater than Abraham. That's like shocking for a Jewish person to hear. Jesus is greater than Abraham. Easy for us, but not for Matthew's hearers. He is greater than Abraham's promise. He is a greater covenant. Jesus is also greater than Moses. Imagine telling that to a Jewish person. The teacher of Israel now comes second place to Jesus. He is a greater teacher because Jesus teaches the new and the living way. You begin to understand how Matthew's gospel is radical to his hearers. Jesus is greater than David. Like deep breath, gasp. King David. How can that be? How can that be? Jesus is not just a great king, according to Matthew. He is Israel's king, the King of Kings, the one that they've been waiting for. And then just to make it contemporary, to throw it into the mix, he says that Jesus is greater than John the Baptist. John baptized with water, but remember what Matthew said? That Jesus would baptize with the Holy Spirit and fire. See, Matthew's good news is a very special portrait of Jesus. Jesus is not a new kid on the block. He's not like some super cool celebrity that's kind of floated into town with an entourage and announcing some new way, this like new philosophy for how to do life. Rather, he is a continuation and the fulfillment of Israel's long-awaited hope. Everything that they'd been waiting for, everything that they'd hoped for in Abraham and in Moses and in David was now fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is their king. Jesus is their Messiah. And because, right now this is where it gets relevant for us, because Jesus is greater than Abraham, greater than Moses, and greater than David, then is he not worthy of their full allegiance? He absolutely is. This is Matthew's case and point. He is moving his readers to a decision. We always have to make a decision about what we will do with Jesus. But you know what decision we can't make is one foot in the old, one foot in the new. One foot in our old hope, one foot in our new hope. It doesn't work that way. Because what Matthew has done in his gospel has explained that because Jesus is greater than Abraham and greater than Moses and greater than David, why would you put your hope in them when you know there is a better way, and that way is Jesus? Now that probably came not as good news, but as bad news to a whole bunch of people who thought they were righteous. But you remember what Jesus said in Matthew's house that night to the Pharisees? He said, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. New Living Translation, I have not come to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. And that is, church, really good news. And so what I want to invite you to do this week is just a couple of things that participate with us on this, is dig into the Gospel of Matthew. With these tools that you have, this kind of framework for understanding, that Matthew just wants us to see that Jesus is greater than everyone and everything. And because that's true, demands our allegiance and our commitment and our worship. Dig into Matthew's gospel. I know it's 28 chapters, and you're going, Steve, we've got 6 days between now and the next time we're together. I'm never going to read that much. But just pick a few passages and dig into it and see that Jesus doesn't come as a greater one, a greater king to you. And then secondly, I just want you over the course of this series to start thinking about your own portrait. What's the portrait of Jesus that you're painting with your life? As you think about your story, your testimony, about the surprising love of God in your life, what is the story, the portrait, the picture that your life is painting? We're going to be finishing each of these little short messages each week with an actual real life story of someone who has encountered the radical love of Jesus and now is painting a picture, painting a portrait of Jesus. I'm going to invite you to turn your attention to the screen, and we're going to watch Marianne's story. Marianne's around somewhere, actually volunteering today on a camera or something somewhere. Just amazing. But let's listen to her story of Jesus.
Hey, I've been meaning to write to you for a while now. So here I go. I wanted to thank you for this extraordinary life you have given me. You have blessed me with a supportive family. You have surrounded me with people I didn't know I needed. My career, being able to live here in Australia, and in my home to which I live in. In this life, you have granted me to be creative, to be curious of the world and the plans you have laid out for me, to savor the moments with your creations, to meet people and know their stories, to follow my dreams and to not be afraid. This has been amazing. But as you have probably known, it hasn't always been like this. I feel like my life is full of what ifs and what nows, and to be honest, it's been very difficult for me to move on at times. Remember that time when I was growing up as a teenager? Mom was sick with terminal cancer, and I had to give decisions and consents to the medical team that were vital to keep her alive. Yeah, that was really rough. I remember I kept asking, why me? Why now? I remember that moment really made me feel how real life was for me. Thinking about it now, I still have no idea how I got through that part of my life. Even though I still think of what life would have been like if Mom were still alive, and I'm still yet to find the answers as to why she was taken away from me too soon, I rest in the truth that you are the only constant in this life. As I continue to lean on you, I'm realizing that you have been walking with me all along. The pain of losing Mom brought me to a place where I experienced how you heal and comfort the brokenhearted. That has taught me that pain is not forever, and that we have to cherish not only the little things, but also the big things. It has taught me that you are the only forever in this life. I rest in the peace I find in you, knowing that you will always be with me, to show me what you want me to see in this life.